Welcome to the dark side of love. It's not the kind of love they write songs about, not the kind you wrap in lace and tie with a ribbon. It's the kind that hides in the shadow between choices, breathing in the quiet moments when no one else is looking. It's beautiful, and it's wrong. The classroom was quiet in a way that almost felt alive. Not silent, alive. The faint hum of the old fluorescent lights. The way the afternoon sun spilled through the half-drawn blinds in long, tired stripes. Dust motes drifted in the air like tiny, weightless secrets. I sat behind my desk, red pen in hand, sifting through a pile of essays that smelled faintly of printer ink and teenage sweat. My handwriting corrections curled across the margins, neater than they needed to be, because neatness was the one thing I could control. And then, a knock. Soft, barely there. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway. Jake. He was leaning against the frame like he wasn't sure he wanted to come in. 18 years old, but he carried himself like someone who'd already lived more life than he should have. Tall, athletic, but not in that loud, arrogant way. He had a calm to him, a self-possession that set him apart from the others. He'd always been the kind of student who lingered after class, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Sometimes he stayed to ask about the reading, sometimes to share a thought that didn't fit into the day's lesson. But this was different. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Something heavier, something dangerous. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, voice low. I set my pen down, masking the flicker of curiosity with the practiced neutrality of a teacher who's been trained not to read too much into anything. "Of course," I said. "Is this about your paper, or—" He shook his head. "It's personal." That caught me off guard. Personal could mean anything. A fight with his parents, a breakup, a moment of vulnerability teenagers rarely let slip. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Not right away. He stepped further in, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. He finally sat across from me, eyes lowered for a second before meeting mine. "I think," he started, then paused, like the words had to fight their way out of him. "I think I'm in love with someone." I gave a small, knowing smile. Harmless, I thought. Just a crush. Maybe a classmate. Maybe someone he thought I could give advice about. But then he said it. "It's you." Everything stopped. The hum of the lights, the faint tapping of a branch against the window, even the air seemed to hold its breath. 1,000 thoughts collided in my head, each one trying to be the loudest. I should shut this down. I should correct him. I should call this what it is, wrong. But none of those thoughts made it to my lips. He stood, not looming, not advancing, just moving closer, like gravity had quietly decided we belonged in the same orbit. "I know it's not right," he said, his voice steady but soft, "but I see the way you look at me." I opened my mouth to tell him he was imagining it, that he'd misread everything, but I couldn't, because he hadn't. I turned away, walking to the window, pretending to look out, while really looking at my reflection in the glass. I was married. I was his teacher. This was madness. And yet, somewhere in the hollow of my chest, something stirred, something I hadn't felt in years. He didn't press closer, didn't try to touch me. He just let the words linger, the way you might let perfume hang in the air. "You deserve someone who sees you," he said. And then he left. That night, I lay in bed beside a man I used to love. Eric's breathing was slow, steady, distant. The kind of sleep you fall into when the person beside you is just a body now, not a connection. Jake's words echoed in the dark, louder than the silence between me and my husband. "You deserve someone who sees you." And next morning, at school, Jake barely looked at me. Not a lingering glance. Not the usual half smile he'd give when I passed his desk. Just nothing. It shouldn't have bothered me. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Because absence has its own kind of weight, and his felt heavier than I expected. In the staff room, voices droned about grading deadlines and lesson plans. I nodded where I was supposed to, poured coffee I didn't even want, and pretended not to notice that I was checking the hallway every time a door opened. By lunch, I hated myself for noticing. By last period, I hated myself for caring. But I did. God help me, I did. When the bell rang, my students poured out in their usual rush, a blur of backpacks and laughter. Jake slipped out with them, eyes forward, like I was just another piece of classroom furniture. The air felt emptier after he left, and that emptiness followed me home. Eric was already in the living room when I walked in, TV on, socks half off his feet. He glanced up just long enough to say, "Hey," before turning back to the game. Dinner was quiet, except for the sound of cutlery and the low hum of the dishwasher. We spoke in fragments about bills, the weather, a call from his mother, but never about us. Not anymore. Somewhere between the lines of conversation, I realized I had gone invisible in my own home. And that's when Jake's words came back to me. "You deserve someone who sees you." That night, I lay awake while Eric's breathing fell into its predictable rhythm. I closed my eyes and, without meaning to, saw Jake leaning in my doorway again. The sharpness of his gaze, the way he seemed to stand in a moment longer than most people could bear. I told myself I wasn't going to think about it anymore. I told myself this was just a passing ripple in a very still pond. But the truth? The truth was that I had already started waiting for something I couldn't name. Thursday came. The last bell had rung, and the classroom was nearly empty when I noticed him still there. No words this time, just a folded piece of paper placed gently on my desk. He worked out before I could even ask what it was. I waited until the hallway noises faded before opening it. A poem, raw, unpolished, burning with something that didn't belong in this world. Desire, restraint. Every line, unmistakably about me. My hands trembled as I read it again and again. I should have thrown it away. I should have reported it. But instead, I folded it neatly and tucked it inside the back of my planner, close enough to reach for when I wanted it, close enough to feel like it was still his hand, still his words, against my skin. That weekend, Eric left for a cabin trip with his brothers. The house felt bigger, emptier, and the quiet didn't soothe me. It scraped against my thoughts, pulling at the thread I'd been trying to hold together. By Saturday evening, my resolve had frayed completely. I messaged Jake. No questions, no excuses, just a time, a place. He replied instantly, like he'd been waiting. When the knock came, I opened the door in sweatpants and a tank top, telling myself it wasn't a seduction. But when I saw the way he looked at me, I knew better. There weren't long conversations, no drawn-out explanations, just a kiss, soft at first, almost unsure, until it wasn't. We moved to the couch, breaths quickening. His touch was slow but certain, like he had already memorized the shape of me in his mind. I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. Not just existing, but seen, desired, chosen. Later, we lay in the dark, his head on my chest, our skin warm from what we'd just done. I don't regret this, he whispered. And God help me, neither did I. The days after, everything shifted. I started dressing differently. Perfume in the mornings, a touch of lipstick I hadn't worn in months. My coworkers noticed. So did Eric, but he didn't ask. At school, Jake and I kept our distance. We didn't linger in hallways or exchange knowing glances. But at night, we were fire, meeting in parking lots, empty apartments, and the quiet shadows of streets that never told our secrets. He was graduating soon. I told myself it would end, that it had to. But every time he touched me, it felt less like an ending and more like the start of something neither of us could walk away from. I knew the risks, the whispers that would follow, the consequences waiting to crush us both. But for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Jake made me laugh again, made me feel like I was more than just a role, more than a wife, more than a teacher, more than a name on someone's payroll. He made me feel human. I tried to imagine walking away, closing the door, pretending it never happened. But the thought felt like tearing out a piece of myself I wasn't ready to lose. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back, not in shame, but in wonder. One night, in a cheap motel room, he traced the curve of my shoulder with his fingers. "You deserve more," he whispered. And for a fleeting second, I believed him. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last forever. He would move on, graduate, and I would be left with the life I'd built, a life that suddenly felt too small for me. They say affairs are about what's missing, but sometimes they're about what you suddenly find. For a brief, impossible moment, in a world ruled by rules and routines, I was free, and I will never forget what it felt like to be seen.